responsibilities at home and even changed their diets. The military got the best food, while everyone else tightened their belts and found ways to make do.
Ever wondered what people ate to survive during the Civil War? Get ready to dive into some of the strangest and most inventive meals from one of America's most challenging eras. Stick around as we uncover the fascinating world of Civil War cuisine. You won't believe what they came up with. Number 5. Coffee from alternative sources. Ever wonder how soldiers brewed coffee without actual coffee beans during the Civil War? Coffee was something both Union and Confederate soldiers consumed a lot of, but it wasn't always available. To make coffee-like consumables, soldiers resorted to using substitutions. This meant brewing peanuts, chicory, grains like rye, pea, and even apples. Other options included acorns, dandelion roots, and sweet potatoes. According to General J.E.B. Stuart, potatoes were peeled and cut into chunks, about the size of coffee berries. The pieces were spread out in the sun to dry, then parched until brown, after which they were ground. The grounds were mixed with a little water until a paste resulted, after which hot water was added. When the ground settled to the bottom of the coffee pot, the beverage could be poured and drunk. Actual coffee beans were not commodities during this time period, and in Atlanta, at least one jeweler used them instead of diamonds in decorative breast pins. The coffee was brewed on fields. It was still something non-combatants probably wouldn't recognize, boiled in an open kettle, and about the color of a brownstone front. Number 24. Peanut hot chocolate. Did you know peanuts were turned into a delightful hot chocolate substitute during the Civil War? Chocolate was essentially unavailable in the South during the time. Thus, creativity won out again. In order to create a drink that resembled hot chocolate, people roasted, skinned, and grounded peanuts. They then boiled the powder with milk and sugar. The mixture was apparently delightful to the palate, according to some sources. Before the Civil War, peanuts were not a widely cultivated crop in the United States. Virginia and North Carolina were the principal producers and were generally viewed as a foodstuff fit for the lowest social classes and for livestock. When they were consumed, they were usually eaten raw, boiled, or roasted, although a few cookbooks suggested ways to make dessert items with them. The goober pea status in the Southern diet changed during the war as other foods became scarce. An excellent source of protein, peanuts were seen as a means of fighting malnutrition, and they still are, with products such as plumpy nut being used in famine-plagued parts of the world. In addition to their pre-war mode of consumption, people used peanuts as a substitute for items that were no longer readily available, such as grinding them to a paste and blending them with milk and sugar when coffee was scarce. This appreciation was real. Andrew F. Smith wrote in Peanuts, The Illustrious History of the Goober Pea. Southerners continued to drink pea beverages decades after the war ended. Pea oil was used to lubricate locomotives when whale oil could not be obtained and had the advantage of not gumming up the machinery, while housewives saw it as a sound stand-in for lard and shortening, as well as lamp fuel. Number 23. Slooosh cornmeal mush. Want to hear about the mushy survival meal called Slooosh that sustained soldiers? While wheat and rice were gone in the mountain and coastal South, respectively, corn was the most widely available staple grain. In addition to cornmeal, troops were rationed salt pork or bacon, along with some coffee or coffee substitutes, salt, and perhaps some peas or beans. There were many variants on how these simple cornmeal and bacon rations were prepared. Some soldiers would pool their rations and have one man designated as a cook. Under this scheme, the cornmeal and bacon grease could be cooked into a larger skillet-sized cake known as corn pone, which might loosely resemble a modern cornbread. Slooosh was a meal made from bacon, grease, and flour. To prepare slooosh, soldiers fried bacon in a large amount of grease, then added watered-down flour that flowed like milk. Then you took the cornmeal and swirled it around in the grease to make the dough and make a snake of it, and put it around your ramrod and cook it over the campfire. That was Slooosh. They ate a lot of that, sometimes called kush. The mixture may have also included beer. Alternatively, it could be stewed with crumbled cornbread. Ideally, Slooosh was cooked until all the liquid was gone, giving it a thick texture and great sustenance. Another version of Slooosh, known as slapjack, featured less water, creating a flour paste that was mixed with grease and browned on one side. The slapjack was then flipped and cooked through. Number 22. Tea from alternative sources. Curious about the strange sources used to brew tea when traditional leaves were scarce? Similar to improvisations made in coffee preparation, alternatives to tea came from unique sources. Tea was even less available than coffee, and as a result, Union and Confederate soldiers alike began brewing tea-like drinks from the leaves of black elder, currant, and huckleberry bushes. They also used sassafras tree bark, corn, or bran. Another common tea was made from beef. Beef tea was made by putting chopped beef into a pot of boiling water. After draining the liquid, it was often served to men in military hospitals, where it was thought to provide medicinal benefits. It may not have been much in terms of taste. However, with one Confederate nurse indicating her patients wouldn't drink it, in common with all soldiers and, I believe, men. Number 21. Watermelon syrup. Did you know watermelon syrup was a creative substitute for sugar during the Civil War? When looking for sweeteners, soldiers turned to molasses when sugar ran low, and as molasses became less available, they used watermelon syrup. Civilian Southerners also consume watermelon syrup alongside sorghum and persimmons as a sugar substitute. The syrup could be used in various ways, such as sweeteners in recipes or to make preserves from watermelon rinds. It was part of the creative culinary adaptations that people undertook in the kitchen and at the campfire to make do with what was available. In addition to syrup made from the juice of watermelons, people made use of watermelon rinds to make preserves. Number 20. Cold ham cake. Ever heard of cold ham cake? A peculiar dish that resembles modern Spam. With the 1859 perfection of the mason jar and the invention of the pressure cooker in 1874, home and commercial canning increased, and pickling became a common winter dish. Cold ham cake, which was described as a cross between pate and Spam. One of the more novel recipes from the Civil War era, this delightful meal sees a giant chunk of ham minced and mixed with pepper, cinnamon, clove, and ginger. Then the whole mess is mashed into a casserole dish and baked until congealed. Sound familiar? Welcome to the world of Spam. Number 19. Pickle Lily. Interested in learning about Pickle Lily, a quirky pickled concoction from the Civil War era? Pickle Lily takes center stage as an hors d'oeuvre. The cucumber, beets, okra, and green beans they've been gardening and preserving for 2 decades would have been found in Indiana then too. Similar to pickled eggs, Pickle Lily found prominence in the mid-1800s as a way to preserve basically anything that needed saving over the winter. A pickling solution was prepared in a cask or jar. Then vegetables were dropped in throughout the season. A number of modern equivalents of these Civil War staples can be found on grocery store shelves today, including cocktail onions, dill pickles, and pickled beets. Number 18. Dry flour biscuits. Want to know how soldiers managed to survive on rock-hard, dry flour biscuits? The most common name was hardtack. One of the staples of the soldier diet was hardtack. unleavened flour mixed with water and then baked and dried beyond recognition. Hardtack was simple, inexpensive, and had a reasonable amount of nutritional value. True to its name, hardtack was hard. People would often dip it in coffee or tea to make it edible. The cracker of sorts typically measured roughly 3 inches by 3 inches and was about half an inch thick. Hardtack was so sturdy, one Illinois soldier reportedly commented, "We live on crackers so hard that if we had loaded our arms with them, we could have slain our enemies in a hurry." Soldiers were routinely rationed about a pound a day of hardtack. Hardtack was susceptible to mold and insect infestations, especially when it wasn't stored properly. According to Army of the Potomac soldier John Davis Billings, eaten in the dark, no one could tell the difference between infested hardtack and hardtack that was untenanted. When they were feeling generous, the soldiers referred to these crackers as hardtack, and the food got its name honestly. Apparently, if soldiers weren't careful, they could chip a tooth on the desiccated stuff. To help rehydrate it and to fill their aching bellies, soldiers devised all kinds of ingenious ways to soften their hardtack. They dipped it in coffee or tea, or cooked it with meat fat to make it edible and protect their teeth. Hardness wasn't its worst quality. Soldiers didn't just call the dry biscuits hardtack, though. They also referred to them as tooth dollars, worm castles, and sheet iron crackers. Those names were fair, too. Insects and other creepy crawlies found their way to the crackers and nestled deeply inside. Number 17. Mule meat. Wonder how mule meat became a standard ration for Confederate soldiers during food shortages? Southerner rations were adequate and varied. On paper. In practice, not so much. Rebel soldiers were usually issued cornbread and bad beef, with cornbread the most constant provision. Basics like vegetables and salt were also often hard to come by. The supply of beef to Southern armies broke down quickly, and as early as 1861, the Confederates' Commissionary General recommended the use of rice and molasses as occasional meat substitutes. Supply and distribution difficulties persisted, however, and occasional became quite often. By 1863, things had gotten bad enough that mule meat was issued as a standard ration item to rebel soldiers. Even mule meat, rice, and molasses, as well as cornbread, were often in short supply. And there were many reports of Southerners who had to subsist for days on handfuls of field peas and parched corn. On top of food shortages and the poor quality of what food actually reached them, Confederate soldiers often lacked adequate cooking ware and eating utensils. Number 16. Risole. Did you know risole was a special treat for soldiers during Thanksgiving in the Civil War? A risole is a small patty enclosed in pastry or rolled in breadcrumbs, usually baked or deep fried. The filling was savory ingredients. Risoles included minced meat, fish, clams, or oysters, mixed with egg and breadcrumbs. The ingredients were then formed into cakes or balls and fried. To season the risole, cayenne pepper and the like were added. It was served as an entree, main course, or side dish. Perhaps not the most common meal of the era, risole was prepared on special occasions like Thanksgiving. Number 15. Pickled Eggs. Ever wondered why pickled eggs were a favorite snack for soldiers in the 1860s? Historically, pickling eggs was a way to preserve them for future use before refrigeration. Kept in a cold place, pickled eggs can last up to 4 months. It's there, sitting on the corner of the bar, eyeing you in all its red, pickled glory from inside a mason jar. If you thought the notorious pickled egg was a modern drunk invention designed specifically for bar flies playing truth or dare, think again. These little beauties were a Southern favorite during the Civil War, when lean times meant turning to unique methods of food preservation. Originally, German immigrants brought the recipe to the Americas. Number 14. The Idiot's Delight. Curious about the Idiot's Delight, a surprisingly popular dish among Civil War troops? This straightforward yet excellent dish, sometimes known as idiot's cake, was one of the Civil War era dishes that quickly became popular among troops. This deep dish, dark brown float of biscuit-like things in a rich cinnamon raisin sauce was frequently seen in parcels troops received from home, despite not being as popular as the other dishes. It was believed that even a fool could cook it since it was simple to put together from an easily accessible component, hence the name of the dish. Number 13. Cornbread. Want to hear about the role cornbread played in feeding soldiers during the Civil War? The most home-cooked food that could be found during the Civil War was cornmeal combined with water and baked over an open flame. The troops would eat cornbread long after its wetness and freshness had vanished, so they wouldn't have to go to work hungry. Even some Confederate troops used their muskets to cook cornbread. They made a dough out of the cornmeal and then wrapped it around the ramrod to cook. The end product was burnt but still edible. Cornbread played a vital role in feeding soldiers during the Civil War. You may have heard of hardtack, an unleavened bread made from only flour and water used to feed troops using as little resources as possible. Corntack was the cornbread equivalent, made from cornmeal and water by Union and Confederate soldiers alike. Corntack was made using many of the same cooking methods used by enslaved Americans, since the soldiers also often cooked over open fires as they moved from camp to camp. It was often crumbled over beans or in stew. The bread has been the subject of many Civil War soldier accounts who complained of corntack's lack of flavor and unappealing texture. Through time, corntack and hardtack have become symbolic of the hardships that Civil War soldiers endured. They are discussed in classrooms and used in reenactments today to give people a taste of what life was like during this time. Number 12. Swamp cabbage. Interested in how swamp cabbage stew sustained soldiers in the southern marshlands? A traditional southern cuisine, swamp cabbage stew is made even better with the addition of salty pork. Impemia aquatica, often known as swamp cabbage, was gathered from the many marshes in the south and was a popular stewing component. The heart of a sable palm tree, which can be found in the swamps, was most likely used over traditional real cabbage. Swamp cabbage is a plant that's also known as a sable palm or cabbage palm tree. It just also happens to be Florida's state tree, and you'll find it in nearly every part of the state, as it grows throughout the southeast and parts of Mexico. Tall in the sable palm just below the leaves is the heart of the palm, and it has been eaten for generations in all sorts of dishes, such as salads and the eponymous swamp cabbage, of course. Eaten alone, it's a simple dinner that's bolstered by the bacon and sausage or other meats used to build up flavor. But it's often served as a side dish too, alongside fried fish and boiled shrimp. Harvesting this edible portion of the plant results in the death of the tree. Number 11. Pemmican. Ever heard of pemmican, the survival food with a long shelf life during the Civil War? Native American women developed the nourishing, preserved delicacy known as pemmican. Pimi, the Cree Chippewa word meaning fat, is from where the word pemmican originates. Pemmican was also accessible for the soldiers, albeit less popular than other meals during the Civil War era. Soldiers frequently make fun of the pemmican that is provided to them, since the quality of the meat used to make it is questionable. It is said to be composed of rotting old dried beef and leftover soap factory fat. They'd use the rats, and if they survived, they would have the confidence to eat pemmican. They would create their own food, frequently using leftover meat or dried jerky that they would pound out, combine with fat and fresh berries, and then re-dry. This survival meal has a great shelf life, if properly preserved. Number 10. Lobster and butter were sought-after items. Did you know vendors sold luxury items like lobster near Civil War battlefields? The Civil War is remembered for the strange spectatorship with which it was viewed by the public. After all, people really did pack picnics to watch the Battle of Bull Run in 1861. However, people didn't initially realize the length and the bloodshed the war would entail. So perhaps it comes as little surprise that vendors sold their wares near the arena of battle. In fact, they hawked luxury goods like lobster, butter, and buttermilk at military camps. Seeing a monopolistic opportunity, though, vendors raised their prices so much that soldiers couldn't actually afford their products. It got bad enough that soldiers rioted in response to the price hikes in 1863. Number 9. Minced Saltfish. Wondering how minced saltfish was prepared to sustain soldiers during wartime?
This is Daddy from Busy Daddy Cooks. Today we are making steamed minced pork with salted fish.
Trust the Gordon's fisherman. He brought his fish sticks recipe all the way from the 1800s. The Young Housekeeper's Friend cookbook by Mary Hooker Cornelius has a recipe for minced salt fish, a brown mixture of fish, potato, and milk, served as a cake and tasting exactly the same as the modern thing. Don't forget the mayo. Number 8. Commissionary Beef Stew. James M. Sanderson, a member of the U.S. Sanitary Commission, better known as the Sanitary, was troubled by the injurious and unwholesome mode of cooking within volunteer regiments. He began to experiment with different methods of cooking, developing more efficient ways to use campfires, cooking pots, and other wares in camps. He also advised cooks to limit the use of fat as well as sugar and salt, and to avoid overboiling beans. Sanderson came up with more than 18 soups, stews, and meat and vegetable recipes, including what was known as Commissionary Brazilian stew. The recipe brought together cubed beef, dipped in vinegar and stewed with onions. The mixture was heated over low heat for several hours, and sometimes potatoes were added for a heartier meal. Beef stew is such a fundamental and flexible dish that I was pretty sure that the Civil War soldiers would have eaten many versions of it.
You're eating it, you're still bringing it in and having your meals every day, but you're also storing food back.
However, I recently came across a book that was published in 1862 by the Government Printing Office to give instructions to Union soldiers in the field. It includes a recipe for beef stew. Number 7. Desiccated Vegetables. Fresh vegetables were at a minimum during the period of unrest, and soldiers resorted to eating desiccated alternatives instead. Known as desecrated vegetables, desiccated vegetables included carrots, parsnips, turnips, and greens that were dried and added to soups and stews. Desiccated vegetables were used as substitutes for beans, potatoes, and rice, often compressed into blocks and cut into cubes for quick use. These dried vegetables weren't appealing, but they helped ward off scurvy and other maladies related to vitamin deficiencies. Soldiers' rations had to be portable, and they had to have the longest possible shelf life. Consequently, the majority of foodstuffs soldiers received came in a preserved form. Meat, fruit, and vegetable rations all came desiccated or desecrated according to the soldiers. In addition to being dried out, vegetable rations were tiny and cubed. They needed a water soak or a long boil to be edible. While soldiers enjoyed the few and far between fruit rations, they disliked their desecrated vegetables as much as they disliked their rock-hard hardtack. Number 6. Water cakes or ash cakes. It was very common for soldiers in the 18th century, especially when they were on the march, to be issued their rations several days ahead of time.
Now the thinner this is, the faster it's gonna cook.
They would be issued several days of their bread ration, and because they would be gone for a while, they would likely be given just flour, as bread would just go bad. They were also on the march with very little equipment to use as well, and all they had was flour, and they would have to make some kind of food with it. Water cakes were simple enough, with 2 lightly beaten eggs mixed with salt, cold water, and flour to form a thick batter. The batter was baked and eaten with butter. An eggless cake alternative was an ash cake. Ash cakes were made using cornmeal and boiling water. After adding salt, the mixture was shaped into flat cakes, wrapped in corn husks, and placed under hot ashes to cook. When cooked in a pan instead, the result was called a hoe cake. If it was cooked in an oven, it was called pone. Number 5. Salt beef or salt pork. Did you know salt beef or salt pork were essential rations for soldiers on the move? Salt beef was a standard ration during the time, one that could be swapped out for salt pork. Both meats had a lot of uses. Cooks could boil it, serve it uncooked, sandwiched between hardtack, or stew it with beans.
Don't worry, if it gets a bit messy, you can reuse that salt on the same piece of meat.
Later referred to as indigestible ration, salt pork was an indispensable one, according to John Davis Billings. He found it preservable to musty and rancid, salt horse, and other stringy or flabby alternatives. Salt pork was commonly referred to as bacon in the 1860s. Today's bacon is smoked, cured pork that is crisped up in the oven. It was a catch-all phrase for dried salted hog flesh back then. Because salt pork was so portable, it frequently included undesirable meats like connective tissue and organ meat. The meat was better preserved by the salt, although it still has a limited shelf life. Salt is easy to overlook today, but before refrigeration, it was essential for preserving food and curing leather, not to mention that a minimum amount of salt is necessary for a healthy diet. Union officials realized early in the war that salt was the key to feeding soldiers and civilians in the South. As soon as Southerners built their own facilities to make salt, they became military targets. Salting, especially of meat, is an ancient preservation technique. The salt draws out moisture and creates an environment inhospitable to bacteria. If salted in cold weather so that the meat does not spoil while the salt has time to take effect, salted meat can last for years. Number 4. Hog and Hony. Hog and Hony comprise pork and hominy. Hominy is dried corn kernels cooked until tender and then hulled. The type of corn usually used is sometimes referred to as feed corn. It was common in the South and could be served for any meal. At breakfast and supper alike, it could accompany waffles or corn cakes. Sometimes hog and hominy was served with greens and potatoes as well. The hog and hominy diet was so associated with the South that as the struggle to control the Mississippi River played out during the conflict, Abraham Lincoln lamented, Confederate success would mean hog and hominy without limit. This observation highlighted the importance of the Union winning the Siege of Vicksburg in 1863. Number 3. Skilly Gal. Soldiers turned hardtack into Skilly Gal. To make it more appetizing. This is proof that there's nothing a little pork fat can't fix. When it came to hardtack, soldiers had to get creative. After all, even if it weren't filled with bugs, the rock-like biscuit could still break your teeth as a result of its dryness. Occasionally, soldiers took the natural route and soaked the crackers in coffee, tea, soup, and other liquids. However, culinary-minded soldiers also elected to fry up the crackers in pork fat, which they called Skilly Gal. This technique both stretched the rations further and made the dried-out biscuits a whole lot more appealing. If a soldier could afford to spend some of their monthly pay, they might buy ingredients from a sutler, a merchant who sold goods to encamped soldiers. Number 2. Beef tea. Ever heard of beef tea? The nutritious broth that kept soldiers hydrated during the Civil War? In the latter half of the 18th century and the early 19th century, illness of any kind was not to be taken lightly. A simple head cold or case of influenza, if not properly cared for, could easily prove fatal. Illness, disease, and death were topics Isabella Alden regularly dealt with in her books, but she also gave insight into the remedies of the time. Patient medicines were widely available, but home cures were even more popular. By far, the most popular cure Isabella mentioned in her books was beef tea, and for good reason. beef tea was more frequently prepared for invalids and patients than any other curative.
In the US and the UK, beef tea, an antiquated health cure from the early 1800s.
In 1863, the New York Times published an article about care Union soldiers received during the Civil War, citing their beef tea diet as part of their daily fare in hospital, its excellence and variety, and the admirable arrangements for their comfort. Beef tea also provided soldiers with hydration and protein, and it helped stretch the scanty provisions at camps too. Soldiers had scant provisions and few too had no cooking skills. But malnutrition, starvation, dehydration, and scurvy definitely affected those who couldn't figure out how to prepare and maximize the provisions they did have. One way to stretch provisions and to hydrate involved boiling beef and bones in water, creating what's called a beef tea. Beef teas enabled soldiers to leach protein into the water during the boil. And number 1, ramrod roll. Confederate soldiers cooked cornmeal on their muskets. They called it ramrod roll. Among their other scant provisions, Confederate soldiers received rations of cornmeal. Cooking can be pretty tricky when you've got no pots or pans, so soldiers on the move on both sides had to get crafty, and they came up with a unique method for preparing it. They would turn their flour and cornmeal rations into dough, coil it into a long rope, then wrap it around the ramrod of a musket, the tool used to force the charge down a barrel of their muskets. From there, the hungry men cooked the dough over an open flame. The resulting ramrod roll came out blackened but edible, just barely. As Scarlett O'Hara opined after sampling a piece on a dare from a Confederate soldier in Gone with the Wind, how can they go on fighting if they have this stuff to eat? And there you have it, some of the weirdest meals from the Civil War era that kept soldiers and civilians going. If you enjoyed this journey into history, be sure to check out our other videos for more fascinating insights. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon for notifications. Thanks for watching!